Thailand, Indonesia, Tunisia, Colombia, and Mexico, for example, fertility rates had fallen to near replacement levels. Others that started their program somewhat later, among others Bangladesh, Egypt, China, Morocco, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Iran, and Vietnam, were also showing major fertility declines. Fertility declines over the second half of the 20th century, whether primarily due to strong policies and programs or to more natural responses to improving living standards, and of course in most cases they were due to both, were clearly enough established throughout Asia, the Middle East, and Central and South America that crisis no longer seemed like the right framework to think about population issues by the time the Cairo conference was approaching. It's no wonder then that in the ensuing political struggle between demographers and reproductive rights advocates at Cairo, the latter emerged victorious. The demographers simply had a less compelling case. For 3 decades, political leaders to a greater or lesser degree had been willing to accord a lower priority to the protection of reproductive rights than to a sense of demographic urgency, often explicitly recognizing that they were making such a trade-off and explaining it as a lesser evil. By the time of Cairo, few, if any, any longer found it possible to sustain such a position. The years since Cairo have been very difficult ones for the erstwhile population movement. I use this term advisedly because, in fact, while a version of that movement still exists, it can no longer be called by that name. The famous paradigm shift of Cairo so thoroughly changed the rules of the game, as well as the shape of the arena, that we are now compelled to refer to the movement in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights, which you must admit is quite a mouthful. What had 20 years earlier been an international movement to promote a particular set of policies and programs to reduce population growth became, after 1994, a movement to promote reproductive and later sexual health and rights as ends in themselves. I don't pass judgment on this major shift in the movement's goals and content. I see it as the natural consequence of a series of changes in the global environment, some of them political, some demographic, others social and cultural. What I will say, however, is that the virtual disappearance of the demographic rationale took with it the very strong sense of urgency, even imperative to action, that the population crisis mentality inspired. I state this as a fact, not as a lament. Whether one thinks of rapid population growth as ever having been a global threat, or whether one rejoices in the shift to a rights-based approach, I think we all must recognize that the change that occurred at Cairo resulted in a much lower priority for reproductive and sexual health programs than their more narrowly defined family planning predecessors enjoyed. Since the high water mark in the year following Cairo, 1995, funding for population activities as defined in the Cairo Program of Action has fallen considerably. Funding for family planning, I estimate, has fallen by some 30%. There are several reasons for this beyond the 2 major factors I mentioned earlier: the US policy shift and the fall in fertility in much of the world. Additional factors would include the following. First, changing priorities in the health sector, including, of course, the HIV/AIDS pandemic. Second, the failure to include any reference to the Cairo goals in the Millennium Development Goals, itself a reflection of the lower sense of urgency that I've been describing. Third, the changing architecture of international development cooperation, with its strong emphasis on budget and sector support and country ownership, a recognition that the population crisis consensus was always more strongly felt by donors than by the recipients of aid. And finally, confusion and to some degree controversy surrounding the term sexual and reproductive health and rights. As a consequence of these multiple and somewhat interrelated factors, the simple truth is that in many countries today, individuals, women in particular, have less help and less power to exercise control over their own reproduction and their reproductive health than they did a decade ago. The decline in funding, in other words, is making a mockery of the Cairo commitment to universal access to reproductive health. Now, having tried to remain objective and descriptive in my historical overview, permit me to become a bit more normative and prescriptive in my remaining comments. I think that the retreat that I've just described is a bad thing and highly regrettable. And I think this for reasons that have to do with global macro concerns as well as concerns about the welfare of individuals and families. In other words, I want now to try to answer the question with which this series of lectures began. Is population still an important global issue? And if so, what interventions are compatible with today's development thinking? Let me begin by saying that I want to treat the term population as signifying both rapid population growth as it refers to countries and as high fertility as it applies to individuals. I believe that countries that experience rapid population growth would be better off if the growth rate were moderated, and I believe that individuals, particularly poor people who have high fertility as the result of unplanned or unintended pregnancies, would be better off if their fertility were lower. By rapid population growth, I mean rates of natural increase over 2% per year, and by high fertility, I mean total fertility rates of over 3 children per woman. Generally speaking, countries with rates of natural increase over 2 have considerable difficulty keeping pace with the demand for jobs, the need to build classrooms and train teachers, the need for health facilities, the ability to produce sufficient food to meet domestic caloric and nutritional requirements, and the ability to invest resources in ways that promote economic growth. Research in recent years has clearly shown that reducing population growth rates provides countries with a window of opportunity, also known as a demographic bonus. This happens when fewer births results in a smaller dependent population, particularly of children under age 15, and a larger workforce relative to the dependent population. If countries invest wisely and appropriately, as the Asian tigers did during the 1960s and 1970s, they can take advantage of this one-time bonus to catapult themselves to considerably higher levels of productivity and growth, thus initiating a self-sustaining path to prosperity. Other countries which have experienced and cashed in on this bonus include Brazil and Chile, and today undoubtedly China and India. In other words, reducing fertility is by no means a sufficient condition for economic growth, but it may be a necessary one. I'm not aware of any country experiencing rapid population growth, as I have defined it, that has enjoyed rapid or sustained economic growth, except a handful of states whose wealth is the result of extensive petroleum exports. Furthermore, once the process begins, it becomes something of a virtuous circle. The better countries do economically, the lower fertility falls, thus mutually reinforcing, up to a point, the growth and prosperity processes. Many of you must have read last week's Economist magazine cover story. They did an excellent job, I think, of explaining this interaction of demography and economics. If you haven't, I commend it to you, and I gather there are copies available on the table over there.